Well, good morning, church. Happy Sabbath. Happy November. Got colder this week. Is that a good thing? When I feel that cold weather and I find myself shivering, only one thing comes to mind. The Christmas decorations at Calimesa are on their way. Have you started limbering up your training routines? I hope so. Dr. Bob, thank you for your prayer this morning and for your continued leadership in this church. We love you very much. How did you get here this morning? Was it your choice or someone else's? Did you bring yourself or were you brought by another? Are you here because of something that has happened in your past or because of something you're hoping will happen in your future? I'd like to share with you briefly how I got here this morning. I was born in this house on Cabinet Circle in Sacramento, California, to Edward and Patricia Rennacker. Lucky for me, I had 3 older siblings who could help pave the way. Unlucky for me, I had a father who was an alcoholic and had to be out of my life by the time I was 5. My mother raised us in that home and a few others with plenty of help from family and friends. We always had pets, never had church, and rarely had money. But we were happy, mostly. Despite my mother's more independent ways, her mother was a more traditional Christian, a longtime member of the Presbyterian Church, and so she thought it'd be good if we went to Christian schooling. She had heard good things about the local Adventist school, and so we went to Sacramento Adventist Academy for 1 year on her dime. Unfortunately, at the end of the year, my grandmother passed away, and our time at church school was over, or so we thought. My mother decided that as soon as each of us entered into middle school, we had to go back to that nice Christian school. And with the help of the school and the local church, we were able to return. I stayed through my high school graduation in 2007, meaning I went from an awkward 12-year-old to an awkward 17-year-old. I had also become a Seventh-day Adventist during that time, and it has remained my community ever since. Now let me ask you a question. Did I choose to become a Seventh-day Adventist? Or did somebody else choose it for me? I think the answer is yes. One moment really stands out on my journey to today. I was 15, and by this time, church had become a weekly routine for me. My mom would take me in her little blue Toyota pickup truck. She'd drop me off, head back home to be with my siblings, and then at the end, come and pick me up to take me home. And we coordinated all of that without cell phones. Unbelievable. The reason I loved going to church was, of course, my friends were there. It was a big church, and so all of us high school students, we'd sit together in a very specific section off to the side so we could talk with each other through the entire service. We would also send texts, literal handwritten ones, pass them down the pew. We would have a great time until the preacher finally announced our freedom with that holy word, amen. I loved church. Now, several of our youth today are actually sitting up in the balcony together. Let's see if they're paying attention to the sermon or not. Okay, good. Looks good, guys. You may think that's a picture. It's a video. They're just that focused right now. Hi. Well, then I started to take my spiritual life a little bit more seriously. And I decided, when I go to church, I kind of want to sing. I want to listen. I want to learn. But I also wanted to sit with my friends. And so on one particular Sabbath, I showed up, opened up the doors, and I felt moved to move. That I should not sit in the corner this time with the youth, and maybe sit somewhere in the center. But then I started having an internal argument. The center? Do you know who sits in the center aisle at church? Old people. Really old people, like 40-year-olds. I can't sit with them, and I'd probably be alone. But I really felt pulled that way, and so I found a spot in the middle halfway back. And on that Sabbath, the youth in the corner were especially talkative, probably talking about how they missed me or something. But it got so bad that during the middle of the sermon, in front of everyone, the pastor stopped what he was saying, turned to the youth and said, "Excuse me, but are you finished?" I had never seen that before. Suddenly, the youth corner got quiet. Shh. Also something I had never seen before. And I was so happy that I had been sitting in the center that day. I think I had said, "I know, seriously." Before his sermon was over, he had to stop a second time and reprimand them again. And from that day forward, as you can imagine, I never sat off to the side again. I always sat in the center. And when I think back on that now, I see it as one of the more formative experiences in my life. Not only did my future days at church become a whole lot richer, but I had prioritized my own personal growth over social opportunities and seen the immediate fruit of that. It changed the trajectory of my life, and I believe is another major reason why I'm here this morning. And so how did you get here this morning? This month we begin our look into God's provision as found in the first half of the book of Exodus. Likely a story you're familiar with. Whether or not, here's how it begins. Once upon a time, the Israelites and the Egyptians lived happily together along the Great Nile, the result of a union that dated back to Egypt's king inviting the family of his favorite official to move down and avoid the drought in their homeland. That family remained long past the famine in the days of Jacob and Joseph, continuing to graze their flocks along the lush northeastern pastures they'd been invited to for many generations. Well, centuries later, however, obviously there's a new king ruling the land, and this king has not been through the story of dreams and drought and deliverance. And so when he looks out onto his nation, he sees a problem, an immigrant infestation. There are so many that, while there's not really a great hint of them wanting to do so, if they were to decide to one day unite against the Egyptians, they could completely take over the country. And so he realizes that he must end this peaceful relationship in order to prevent this peaceful relationship from ending. Brilliant guy. And so he begins with plan A, manual labor. He herds them into a slave workforce, hoping the brutal toil will wear down these foreigners and stop their surging birth rate. And they build at least 2 cities in that time, Ramses and Pithom, but it doesn't stop the baby boom. And so he's got to go to plan B, self-inflicted genocide. He orders the midwives to kill all the newborn Israelite boys. Thankfully, they cannot bring themselves to do it. And they make up a story about the women giving birth just too fast. And it works, and God blesses them for it. And so finally, Pharaoh announces plan C. It's his best one yet. When any Egyptian sees any Israelite baby boys, they are to take them and through an expression of patriotism, toss them into the river. No cleanup, no burial, a perfect plan. Except Pharaoh underestimated the heart of his own people, particularly his own child, because one day his daughter is bathing in that river when she sees a basket floating by. It's retrieved, and inside they discover a baby boy. But not just any baby boy, this is a Hebrew. And so what do you think the daughter of the king who made this decree to get rid of these children would do in that situation? Flip it over and get back to the shower? Listen to what it says. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. And so she had, say this word with me, church, compassion on him, and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." She sees the child, and her heart melts, as you think it would for any person. Her gaze is broken then by an older child who says she knows a woman who can nurse the boy if, the princess would like. And then the princess says, of course. And so the baby is taken by Miriam, his sister, to Jochebed, his mother, who gets paid to foster her own baby. Now that's real brilliance. Baby Moses' life is then fast-forwarded to grown man Moses. And we might assume he lives with his nose turned up too high to see the suffering of his fellow brethren. But in fact, we're told that he is very aware of what's happening. He identifies, in fact, with the oppressed group, and his blood boils at the injustice, though he can't let it be known. Until one day when his life changes forever. Now, it came to pass in those days, when Moses was grown, that he went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So he looked this way and that way. And when he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Moses tries to hide the body and the crime, and he soon discovers that he can't do that because it's already public knowledge. And so he flees east to the land of Midian along what is now the border of Jordan and Saudi Arabia. And there he becomes a husband and a father and basically a nomad, working as a shepherd up until he's 80 years old. And I feel that we can say with near certainty that there were at least some nights that Moses sat under that clear, starry sky and thought to himself, how did I get here? How did I end up in this place? How has my life turned out this way? And I've heard this man's story plenty of times. I'm sure many of you have as well. But in studying it this week, for the first time, I think I realized how much I hold in common with Moses. And if I may be so bold, how much all of us do. How did Moses get there? It began by being placed in a river at the mercy of its streams and direction, to then being placed in the firm and fragile care of others, to then making decisions that eventually found him in, of all places, a dry desert, and yet being prepared for something so much greater just beyond. Can you relate to any of that? You too were placed in that river. Let's call it your circumstances. Born in America to a religious family, or born in California to a broken home. Raised rich or raised poor. Raised open or closed. Raised Adventist or non-Adventist. Raised to love or raised to fear. Have you ever thought about what determines who we become? I asked our collegiate group that this summer, and they came up with this list. of what helps determine this: location of birth, parents, sex, religion, wealth, health, IQ, abilities, decisions, world events, work ethic, era of life, and that's just the start. And then I asked, how many of those do you get to decide? And there are some of them, right? But there are also plenty that we don't. And that can be kind of scary because it takes away that feeling of control, that idea that, well, we determine how our lives unfold. But then I read about Moses, who was placed in a river whose current could have been his carriage or his coffin. He was born into incredibly unique circumstances. And guess what? So were you. And for some, you never have to think about the circumstances you were born into because they were that ideal. And for others, you have spent your whole life working through these circumstances that you were born into. But it's when we realize that we don't determine a lot of it that we're liberated from that illusion of control. We discover our own impotence, and that often leads us into holding on to something that is so much greater than ourselves. And so we find that the first step towards a life with God is often the discovery that it isn't us. And how beautiful and terrifying a step that can be. Well, that river then leads us into the hands of others. Let's call them our influences. Now, there's actually a new popular label that's going around in our culture. I know all of you stay totally up to date with our culture, and so there's this new job people have. It's called being an influencer. Have you heard of this? These are people whose cultural presence is big enough that they can get paid to promote certain products through typically social media. So if, for example, like, let's just say The Rock posts himself on Instagram using a new plant-based organic hand moisturizer, and then at the same time, you remember you do have $75 that you can spare, which is just an example I'm totally making up, obviously. That's an influencer. And this is a big thing. And it's not just celebrities. Even normal people can get paid to be influencers. Or what's more often the case, they think they should get paid to be influencers. I saw a sign recently that said, "For all our sake, this winter, make sure to do your best to help prevent the spread of influencers." But that's not what we're talking about here. We are talking about your influences. Those are those people who loved, mentored, and cared for you. Or did the opposite. The negative influences. And whether they were good or bad, we know that certainly you've gotten to choose some throughout your life, but some were also chosen for you. I was given a very committed mother. I was also given a very troubled father. I was given loving siblings. I had aunts and uncles who helped raise me and coaches and teachers who helped shape me. My mom put me in the Big Brothers program for extra influences, and later I got to choose some of my own at school, both positive and negative, all of which have contributed to me being here. Did you catch some of Moses' influences in the story? Did you by chance notice that all of the good ones were women? Did you see that? We wouldn't even have a Moses if not for the hearts and minds of several women who stood up for what was right in the face of this male-dominated empire. It began with the Hebrew midwives who outsmarted Pharaoh. And then you had Moses' mother who followed the rules by placing her baby in the Nile, but so he would hopefully be discovered and recovered. To Moses' sister, who was ready to be the bridge that would take them from the plantation to the palace. To Pharaoh's daughter, who stood up to her own father by claiming the child as one of her own and raised him to adulthood. It's incredible. And of course, as the old joke goes, Pharaoh's daughter was also the best financer in the Bible because she went down to the bank of the Nile and drew out a little profit. I already regret that one. Do you see the work of these women? They're not just some auxiliary players. They are the stars of the show. And that is not by accident. Clearly, God ordains. No, wait, he can't do that. God calls several women to play massive roles in the salvation of Israel. And they each respond and they serve and they restore what others had only aimed to destroy. It's beautiful. Last year, during Christmas decorating day, John Barrett and I were going to Dr. Bob's to pick up the sleigh because at Calimesa Church, Dr. Bob gets an actual sleigh. I hope it's returning again this year. And John Barrett and I, Bob, is the sleigh returning? Are we going to have it again this year? Come on. Okay, maybe this story will help. John Barrett and I, we go to your house. We're driving there to pick up the sleigh. I don't think this story will help. But John, he says, it's kind of quiet. We're having a truck ride, and he goes, Aren, have you heard the one about the woman who responded to the job ad in the newspaper? I said, no, John, tell me. And he said, yeah, she went to the interview, but in the interview, the guy says to her, you're going to be filling, the jobs of 10 men. And she stood up and shook his hand. She said, I'm sorry, I can't take it. I thought it would be full time. And, John's got a new granddaughter, and I already know she is going to love Grandpa. So who have been your influences? How have they shaped you? How have they helped bring you to today? And finally, you are here because of your experiences. Though he didn't choose it, Moses grew up in Pharaoh's kingdom. Not the theme park that's never open in Redlands, but the actual residence of royalty. Imagine how that shaped him. And then he gets into trouble and he flees to Midian, where he starts a life of shepherding and he learns to survive in the wilderness. And he marries into a family that worships Yahweh. Shepherding, wilderness, Yahweh. Do you think any of that helped prepare him for what was to come next in his life? Do you think that me moving from the side to the center of my church had any impact on what was coming next for me? Do you think that you've ever gone through experiences that prepared you for what was to come? Do you think it's possible you're going through an experience now that is preparing you for something that is just upon the horizon? Now, that's not to say that God is the author of every good and bad thing that happens in our lives. Some feel that way, and that is okay. I tend to see God's role in Moses' story, in my story, and in your story more as the one who can respond to evil by bringing about joy. The one who can respond to oppression by bringing restoration. The one who can respond to death by bringing new life. The one who can love in freedom when all I previously wanted was control. Because life really can feel like being placed in a river. Each of us doing our part to swim. And let me say, that is important. But, eventually we learn that it doesn't direct the current. It does not prevent the rapids. It doesn't stop the winding flow. And so one day, maybe we just allow ourselves to pause and to breathe. And instead of trying to direct the whole stream, we just enjoy the swim. And so how did you get here? It's a good question. But I think a better question is the question that was awaiting Moses in chapter 3. And that's, how do you choose to respond? When we realize our own lack of control, do we respond with grasping or with surrender? When we understand that those around us, even those we disagree with, And even those who make our lives difficult, when we realize that they also are in the river of their circumstances, that they are the product of their influences and their experiences, do we respond with hate or empathy? When we acknowledge that so much has been given to us, do we respond with entitlement or gratitude? And when we recognize what we can control, do we use our power to hurt or to heal? Edmond de Coucy was a French chateau builder in the late 11th century whose life was moving along smoothly until war broke out in his hometown. Soldiers descended and overtook the French, and many countrymen were captured and made prisoners of battle, including de Coucy. He was bound together with dozens of prisoners and forced to march through the city in the middle of summer without food, without water, and without even shoes. Several succumbed to the conditions. The others hoped that they would soon too, including Edmund. Life had been so good, but now he could just pray that it would end soon. But then the prisoners were marched by a monastery. And as de Coucy looked up, he locked eyes with a monk, one of those select few who wouldn't be made a prisoner, one whom the circumstances did not affect like they did for Edmund, one who could have just taken shelter, but instead stood outside and took pity. And as that monk looked back at him, he extended his arm and held out a ladle of cold water. And just as de Coucy's quivering lips descended towards that sip of water, a guard slapped the ladle out of his hand, and the water fell to the dry ground. And the march continued, but de Coucy had been given new life by the act of kindness. And the following year, the war ended, and Edmond de Coucy was still alive. And he returned to his work of chateau building, one that was desperately needed after a destructive battle, and so he made a fortune. And he lived to an old age, but just before passing, he committed one important act. He left most of his money to the monastery that he had been marched by. And when asked why he would give his fortune to a place he had never even set foot inside of, de Coucy is recorded as saying, "Because it was there that a stranger offered me water, and though I never drank of it, that water saved my life." Sometimes we are sent down the river, unable to control where it will lead us. Some days it will take us to a point of deep, deep thirst. Others, we may be the ones who can actually extend our arms and hold out the ladle. And we're left with that question: how do we respond? Because like Moses, your next chapter may be coming too. Your chance to take a stand. Your chance to move from the side to the center. Your chance to be the difference you truly long to see in this world. And you know what's interesting? You may not know it, but you might have been getting prepared for that moment all along. You may be more ready for it than you thought or than you think. And so, look, I may not know how you got here this morning. I'd love to learn sometime. But I'll say this: I'm glad you are here. And I think it leaves us all with one final question, and that is, what's next? Let's bow our heads for prayer. God, we are here, and that in itself is a miracle. So thank you for all that has happened that has brought us here. And I pray that all of us will take a lesson from the life of Moses, somebody who was placed into such unique circumstances and yet was able to eventually respond in service, in leadership, in compassion, in surrender. Lord, help us not to seek out control, but to seek out a life of love, a life of grace, a life with Jesus. We pray this in your name.